Yes, that's a good one. I was just about to start that. Okay, my name is Rhonda Lowe. I am normally, my day-to-day job is Chief of Natural Resource Management at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Cindy Orlando, who is our superintendent, she had to leave. She had a family illness she needed to attend to, so I am covering for her at this meeting. And e aloha kako. It's really good to see you guys, and I appreciate you taking the time to come here to this meeting. Before I forget, I want to extend a warm aloha and mahalo to Cooper Center for letting us use this facility. And I believe, is Hawaii County Police, are they here today? Okay. So they were planning on assisting us with parking and traffic. So they may be helping us as you exit out. So big thanks to them as well. All right. So the purpose of this meeting is to give you a status update on what's going on at the park. What's going on in terms of the current eruptive event, and also in terms of what we're doing in terms of managing park resources and operations, and also public access. We are in the 8th week of this new phase of eruptive activity on Kilauea volcano, and we are in the 7th week of park area closures. There are areas of the park that remain open, such as Kahuku Unit, but our busiest area, Kilauea Summit, and also the areas around Mauna Loa Road, are closed due to the safety hazards associated with this current eruptive event. And so what are those? Well, initially there were a lot of concerns about the ash and the elevated SO2, as well as the increased seismic activity. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen some abatement of those ash events and the SO2 emissions, but we still have very pronounced seismic activity. It's more pronounced the closer you get to the source, which is Halema'uma'u. I notice on my drive, I live around the 24-mile marker, and I feel some of the shakes, but when I come here, I feel a little more, and then when I go into the park, I feel a bit more. And although the majority of these seismic activities are small, some are larger, and it's the cumulative effects that we are seeing in the park, such as the many cracks along the trails and the roads and in some of our facilities, and also in our water line system. And the full extent of those impacts, we really don't know until it's safe enough to go to these areas and really assess that. I understand that the impact of these park closures are very significant to the community and to many people's lives, not just the visitors who come and plan to come to the park, but also to the people who live and work here, the individuals, the businesses, the organizations, the communities in the park, near the park, on the island. They're profound. And for all of us, the question is, how long is this volcanic activity going to last, this new phase? And how does that affect access to Hawaii Volcanoes Park, the different areas? And that's really the purpose of this meeting, is to provide you what we know and how we use that information. And we'll begin with a briefing from USGS scientists from Hawaii Volcanoes Observatory, who will share with you their current knowledge and understanding of this eruptive phase up here. And then our incident commander, John Broward, who is the chief ranger at Hawaii Volcanoes, will talk about how we use that information in terms of managing access in the park. And then we'll follow up with some park staff, including Jessica Farrakane and John Christensen, talking about how this current eruptive phase enclosures have impacted park resources and how we've made changes in terms of our park operations. And then after that, we want to make sure we have enough time to answer your questions. We'll make our staff available to answer your questions, and we want to, hopefully we're going to keep it to 90 minutes, but hopefully that'll give you plenty of time for Q&A. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Scientist-in-Chief Tina Neal of Hawaii Volcanoes Observatory. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Good to see you all again. I think we were just here a few weeks ago talking about ash and VOG and giving you the update at that time. I just want to say a couple things in addition to a thank you to the Park Service for organizing and hosting this and Cooper Center for having everyone here. To the volcano community who is living through what an unprecedented time. I'm glad to be here with you, and I want to assure you that the HVO staff is working as hard as it can to track activity, to measure what's going on, and to try to better understand what's happening so we can provide information to the park and civil defense and to you so everyone can make the best decisions about safety. So tonight you'll hear from familiar faces, Kyle Anderson and Don Swanson, who will give you an update on what the volcano is doing, what we think is happening, and we'll touch on this very important question of how long and how big. Those are very hard questions to answer, so let me just preview that we're not going to give you a wonderful takeaway that will solve all that uncertainty, but we'll do the best we can. And just know that we're constantly working on those questions and trying to get information out in a variety of ways. One of them is our venerable Volcano Watch column that goes out every week, and I'd like to call your attention to this week's column, which just went out. It was written by Brian Shiro, our seismologist, and it tries to explain something about these magnitude 5.2, 5.3 repeating events that are happening every day or so. We're also trying to push out daily information through our updates, and we're pulling together a document that will probably be on our website in the next few days that tries to summarize the activity at the summit and the prognosis for what's coming. So be looking for that when it comes out on our website in the next few days, please. So with that, let me bring up Kyle Anderson, research geophysicist who used to work at HVO, escaped to California, but events of this magnitude have brought him back, and we're glad to have him. He's been working really hard on what is happening here at Kilauea.
Thanks, Tina. So I've been told I have 5 minutes to cover the science, so this is going to be a little rushed, but I promise there is going to be time for questions at the end. So this is maybe the most important slide that I'll present. What is going on right now? Bottom line, 4 things here. Number 1, magma does continue to be withdrawn from the summit reservoir system at a high rate. This is causing ground deformation, cracking, and subsidence over a wide and, in fact, broadening region of the caldera floor in and around Halima'oma'o. That rate, as of our most recent measurement, which was June 21st, is about 10 million cubic meters per day. That's a pretty enormous number, and you can go online to convert that into dump trucks per second or something, but it's pretty huge. Number 3, collapse events at the summit continue. These are happening about once per day. These are the events which earlier in the eruption were producing ash plumes, which went up to 25,000 feet and caused large earthquakes. These are no longer ejecting ballistics around the vent, and ash emissions at this point are really minimal. But the seismicity continues, and by some metrics it may even have increased and be more readily felt recently. These earthquakes are generating shaking, which is damaging facilities in the area and producing rockfalls on caldera walls, etc. So less material being erupted into the atmosphere, very little in fact, but the seismic shaking, of course, continues. And finally, SO2 emissions, very low. That's good news. So I showed a plot like this about 3 weeks ago when I was here before. This is a measure of ground deformation as recorded by an instrument located near the Jagger Museum. This is ground tilt, but you can really think of it as a proxy for inflation and deflation of the magma reservoir. So the horizontal axis here is time that goes from April 30th up until the present. And when that blue line goes up, that means that the reservoir is inflating, and when it goes down, it means that the reservoir is deflating. So early in that time series was the magnitude 6.9 earthquake. The lava lake disappeared around May 10th. The reservoir continued to deflate, Explosions started happening at the summit in mid-May. As time has gone on, each of these offsets here, these vertical peaks, represents one of these collapse explosion events. These are the ones, again, which were previously ejecting plumes into the atmosphere and are not doing so much anymore. We now believe that each of these events is caused by material rock in the caldera slumping inwards and downwards, inwards and towards the magma reservoir. So what's happening is material is being withdrawn from that reservoir at a high rate. That's magma is exiting the summit storage system. It's going down towards the east drift zone. That's creating a low pressure zone, or you can think of it as void space, although it's not that simple. Rock is then slumping downwards to fill the space evacuated by magma as it goes down to the rift zone. So if we zoom in on the tilt at the end here, so this is ground deformation. The bottom is just an enlargement of that going back to, I think, June 15th. Here we can see that the ground deformation, again, is very cyclical, and as a result, so are the earthquakes. So the top plot is earthquakes per hour as a function of time. And the lines are not so clear here, but what you can see is that whenever one of these collapse events happen, and you all know this, you who live up here, the earthquake activity drops off dramatically, and then it picks up gradually, and then we have a large seismic event, and it drops again. And that cycle has repeated remarkably regularly, about every 24 hours for the last couple of weeks. And again, we think that's caused by slumping of material inwards and downwards towards the magma reservoir. So stress is building up, earthquakes are increasing, that slumping event happens, we get a large earthquake, and then the cycle repeats itself. This is a digital elevation model. It's a topographic map of the summit. The left is 2009, and the right is June 21st, 2018. That's our most recent data. These are generated by UAV flights conducted at the summit with the permission of the park. So you can see this is on the left is the familiar Halima'ama'u and the lava lake as it was just starting to form in 2009. And the right is what it looks like more or less now. So enormous changes. That's a volume change of about 300 million cubic meters as of June 21st. The bottom of the crater is deepening with time. It's now about 680 meters above sea level. Maybe that doesn't mean a whole lot, but it's a little over 1,000 feet lower than the old crater floor. So it's very deep. By some metrics, it's probably doubled in diameter. This is an aerial photograph on June 18th, actually, of Halima'ama'u, and it's really unrecognizable, I think, in many ways. This is actually a composition of two photos because it's so large that you can't, in fact, fit it in one with a normal camera lens. So you can see some benches in there. This one in the center here is the old Halima'ama'u crater floor, which has subsided in these episodic slumping events all the way down to the crater. Here on the top, we have old caldera floor, which is partially slumped down towards the crater. And then in the lower left-hand side there, you can see a bunch of dark lines. That is all cracking, which is extending further and further outwards from Halima'ama'u towards the center of the crater, the caldera, excuse me. This is actually an animation. This is a photograph, one photograph taken between every one of these collapse explosion events. And so we start, this will start over in a minute here, I think. We start with a photograph from early May. That's what the summit used to look like. And as we go through, keep your eye on particularly this side of the crater, and you can see subsidence happening. This material drops really out of sight. This is a camera located at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. And as it starts again, maybe keep your eye on the left-hand side. You can see the same thing happens over there. Most of this down-dropping and slumping is happening during these larger events that are about once per day. So this is why the crater is becoming so much larger. This figure is a little bit maybe more complicated to understand. The background is, again, the digital elevation model. So this is a topographic map of the summit. The crater is located, of course, over here. The colors represent the elevation change from this elevation model to 2009. So these purple-red colors represent more deformation. That's about 50 meters. And then grading off to the lighter colors here, which have less deformation. The point here is to show what's happening now in terms of slumping. So as these slumping events continue, the diameter of Halima'ama'u is increasing. Early in this activity, earlier in May, that was predominantly on the west and southwest side of the crater. It's then moved a little bit to the north. And these darker colors show that now it's really extending more to the east and really quite a broad distance across the caldera. The yellow dots are earthquakes, actually, and they give us some idea of where some of that stress is being concentrated. And then finally, the numbers show the amount of downdropping at different points in the caldera. The largest that we've measured is more than 300 feet just to the north of Halemaumau. That's 300 plus because that instrument is no longer operating, so we don't know actually how much it's subsided. But then further, as you get further northeast in the caldera, it becomes a little bit more reasonable at 28 feet. But the bottom line is that region of highly deforming rock in the caldera is extending outwards and broadening the diameter of Halemaumau as a function of time. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Don Swanson. Don is a geologist at HVO. I think he probably needs no introduction. But Don has spent more time viewing this eruption from the summit than anyone else, and he has some really neat photographs to show us.
Thanks, Kyle. The data that Kyle showed are absolutely magnificent. What I want to do now is to show you some photographs of features that I've been able to see during my observations. The first will be a series of photographs of Halemaumau taken from the seat in the dining room of the Volcano House Hotel where I sit and observe things. On May 19th, of course, that was things that were just starting to get going. But over here on June 13th, you can see that the crater has widened dramatically. And notice that it's also dropped, so the top of the tree, which was way below the, you see, it's come way down. It isn't because the tree is growing, it's because the crater is dropping down. Now we'll go to this next period, and June 13th or whatever it is to the 17th, you see that the tree is sticking up much higher. And as of today, here the tree stands probably way up. So obviously the crater is really going down. I spent some time collecting ash from buckets that I had in the parking lot at Halemaumau, and I've given after dark talks about this process. On May 14th, cracks were just starting to form in the parking lot, and also outside of the parking lot in the adjacent trail out to the Halemaumau Overlook. By June 5th, the parking lot was getting very badly disturbed. Curb was being warped. This is an area where the parking bay was here, and this is a median between the parking bays. That was June 5th. On June 11th, this is the same crack. It's at a different place in the parking lot, and it was getting very wide, and there were many more such cracks in the parking lot. On that same day, you could see that the roadway, which is here, in fact, this is the center line of the road. I just brushed the ash off. The block that I'm standing on, I took the photograph, was actually going down. So this, you would, there was an offset there of probably close to 10 feet or so between the, now that has changed dramatically. This is the same area from a different location, safely back away from the rim. And this is the roadway here, if you want to call it a roadway anymore. And this is a normal fault that has dropped the Halemaumau side down, and of course that is going to end up in the crater itself very soon. And this is the photograph I took this morning. The arrows show the road coming in from Keanakekoi. The right-hand arrow is pointing to a segment of road which is detached from the main road farther east by one of these faults. And so the parking lot is no more. There's no doubt about that. I want you to remember this, let's see here. I'm not supposed to move off of this thing, I guess, but there's a big, find the laser pointer here. Doesn't work. Okay. There is a scarp or a fault that forms a cliff that breaks the road. And the next, in 2 slides from now, I want to show you that again. This is a feature that formed near Keanakakoi. That's up in the upper center of the photograph. And this is a big cliff that formed by the caldera dropping down. That formed between Sunday afternoon and Tuesday afternoon of this week. That's an offset of something like probably 30 feet or something on that order. So we don't know exactly during which one of these big events it occurred, but probably either Sunday night or Monday night. And the last slide shows the same feature, but with the red arrows showing that it can be extended all the way from where the left-hand arrow is. That was showing the view in the past slide, all the way around and connecting up here with that fault that detaches the parking lot from the rest of the road. So that is a major fault. Currently, it is the boundary fault of the area that is dropping down. And the arrows point to the level of the caldera floor before this downdropping began. So these changes are that Kyle so well presented in map views are really obviously very apparent when you're in the field. And the changes are doubtless only going to get more with time as the event continues. One final thing, I think I had 5 minutes and I probably used 4.5, so I'll use 30 seconds. Is this an eruption that is taking place at the summit of Kilauea? And an eruption means that material is rising up to the ground surface from below. Well, for the last couple weeks, 2.5 weeks maybe, we haven't had any new material, I don't think, added to the ground surface, except for gas. The ash has essentially stopped being erupted. Probably all of the material that dirties the plume during the big earthquakes is rockfall dust, because the earthquakes generate a lot of rockfalls in the crater. Dust rises and then is carried up by the gas that is being ejected during these events. So we're going to keep calling this an eruption, I'm sure. But technically speaking, it's really interesting that we have an eruption with nothing being erupted except for gas. Thank you. Are you next, John?
Thanks. I don't have any slides, sorry. My name is John Broward. I'm the Chief Ranger, and right now I'm the Incident Commander for this incident. And we are managing this, for those of you not familiar with the term, we're managing it under what we call the Incident Command System, or ICS. And since the beginning of this event back in early May, we've been rotating different incident management teams, and we also actually brought some folks over from the mainland to help us manage it, because those of us that work in the park, in the very beginning, we're working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, for several weeks in a row, and that got kind of old, and I wasn't seeing my family very often, and so that was why we started bringing some teams in from the mainland. And at some point, we realized that it wasn't being cost effective to keep bringing lots of people from the mainland, and we were instructed to try to reduce costs. So we turned it back over to ourselves, and we started managing the incident again, but no longer managing on our 16-hour days, 7 days a week. We've scaled back on our hours, so that's a good thing. And another thing I want to mention is I'm also a resident. I live in the Volcano golf course, so I know what it feels like to have earthquakes constantly going and to live within 2 miles of the Haleʻimaʻamau event. So I'm also speaking as a resident as well as being the Chief Ranger and the current Incident Commander. And we're going to rotate next month. We'll rotate to a different team. Greg Funderburk will take over as IC, and I'm going to get a chance to go to the mainland for a couple of weeks and take some vacation time. So I'll be gone. But to let you guys know what our thought process for the closure is, we base a lot of our decisions on good scientific information. And we're very fortunate to collaborate with USGS. Since I've been here 17 years, and it's been a great experience collaborating and working with USGS. They provide us with information, scientific information, that tells us what the hazards are, or what the hazards could be. We base our decisions on that. So we make our decisions based on good scientific information. So most of the closures right now, in the beginning, as you probably know, a lot of the closures were because of ashfall and because of gases, and also because of seismic activity. Obviously, the ashfall has really decreased greatly. There is still some issues with ashfall that came down like a month ago, that's still out there, that comes up once in a while and causes problems with the road, causes a slick road, things like that. So those don't happen as often, but we do have some areas where ashfall that's been there for a while is still a consideration. Our biggest concern right now is the seismic activity and the earthquakes and the uncertainty of what could happen next. And we have to plan for every kind of event. And we're not expecting a major catastrophic event, but we have to have our plans based on that potentiality. So we also, what we want to do is establish trigger points. So if something bigger is on the horizon, USGS will give us information, they'll provide us information for civil defense, and we'll be able to react based on that information. So we know we have trigger points set up for all kinds of different scenarios, and it's important to understand that we won't open any other areas until the reverse trigger points start happening, where we see, okay, now the seismic activity has decreased, and these are the trigger points that will allow us to reopen at some point in the future. And so areas that are closed are areas we can't, either because there's current damage, and you'll see some slides in a little while here for some of the current damage, either because the current damage won't allow vehicles to drive there. For example, Helena Poly Road, you pretty much can't get past a certain point because there's a big earth crack there. Kilauea Overlook, there's a big puka about 20 feet deep right at the intersection there, so you wouldn't be able to drive there even if you wanted to. You'd fall into a big hole. So some of the damage that's occurred in the park is why that area is closed. But also, in case we want to make sure that if somebody goes into an area, if we did open up an area, that something happened, that nothing would A, happen to them, that they wouldn't be caught up in something, a major event, and B, even small events could create obstacles for us to go rescue somebody or to get to somebody. So that's also a big issue with that. That's not my phone, is it? Okay. I'll turn my phone off. So that would be a big consideration, is being able to reach people. And that's another reason why we have these closures as well. So those are the main reasons why, and also because just be able to reach our equipment. So for example, the other day we had part of the road slump off that goes to where our search and rescue cache is located. When that happened, we wouldn't be able to reach our search and rescue cache, our SAR cache, so we knew we couldn't get it to it. That's been repaired. It took about 4 hours to repair it, so now we can reach that. But we don't know what's going to happen if we allow visitors in sections of the park, even if it's in areas we thought may be safe. Maybe that area might be safe, but the access to get to those people might not be safe to get access to them in case we had to, or if we had to get an ambulance or a fire truck into those areas. So those are all things that we look at when making these decisions. As far as the reopening goes, once we get into the recovery stage, and I just want to say, I believe, with every fiber of my being, that we'll reopen someday, and that we're going to be able to reopen. I truly believe that, and I want to express that to you as my personal opinion. So I believe we're going to reopen, and when we get to that point, even when everything stops, we have to look at our recovery, and it's not going to be right away. We have to bring experts in from all over the country, geomorphologists and structural engineers and scientists. I can't even pronounce their titles for it. They have to come in and give us an assessment of every part of the park. So when we do start thinking about reopening at some point in the future, and again, I believe we will, that we need to kind of look at those, open it in stages and things like that, and what could be open. So, in summary, I think that, I believe we're going to reopen someday. It's going to be a different park. There's no doubt about it. It's going to be completely different, but, it's a time in history that we're all a part of. And, I'm very proud to be a part of that as well for the National Park Service. So, that's kind of it in a nutshell. And now I want to turn it over to Jessica Farrakane, our Public Affairs Specialist.
Good evening, everybody. Aloha. Can I get to my slide from click? Okay, technology. Okay, great. So today, for the first time in 7 weeks, we had our first press conference. We invited a group of 12 media into the park for the first time since the closure happened to help us tell the story of the closure and the continued activity here at the summit. We were able to do this at Waldron Ledge, so we could still have a backdrop of the caldera. And from this grassy spot, that's John talking, but USGS also joined us for that. And we really appreciate the media and USGS and my team's participation in this, because there's nothing like having media outlets help you paint the picture. So even at Waldron Ledge, we're seeing quite a bit of fracturing of the surface levels there. And that's what the crater looked like this morning. It's quite a different experience from Jagger now. Everything looks like there's a light dusting of snow on it, and I have a lot of dust on my boots, but it's a very different experience up at Jagger now. The one thing that really it resonated with Ron and I up there, the koa'ikea are still flying. So our white-tailed tropic birds that nest in the crater walls, there weren't as many as there were before that I've noticed, but there were several that were flying around, and that was astounding. For those of you who don't know this special bird, it's an indigenous seabird to Hawaii. It nests in the walls of craters, but it feeds out at sea. So that was remarkable to see some of those birds there. And I'd like to thank Janice Way, our wonderful photographer, who's supplying me with these great photos today. This is what the crater looked like on May 10th. This was the last day the park was open. And quite a different, it looks manini compared to what it looks like today. It's like this little iki, halimau ma'o iki. Some of the dramatic fracturing happening on the sidewalk near where the buses park, Jagger. You can see we have our own footprints now. We have the footprints out in the Southwest Desert, but we're making our own ash footprints up at Jagger area as well. And yeah, no parking, just like Don said. That's where the road, you can see the road right up here where it goes in, and that was really mind-boggling to observe it from Jagger Museum. And that's looking out towards the southwest. Changes out there. Again, look just like the sands. And just so many fractures, it was impossible to capture all of them and the gravity of them, but this one was rather large and kind of uprooting a pukiave. And fractures near the Jagger luas are continuing every day. John mentioned that these were bigger than what he saw even the other day. So, but on a happy note, I wanted to remind everybody, our staff is quite resilient, not just our staff, but our partners, our Friends of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park and Hawaii Pacific Parks Association, our nonprofit partners. We've been able to open Kahuku unit up to 5 days a week now, and those hours are from 9 to 3. We have all kinds of great programs happening there. So that is now, we have a new trail at Kahuku too, the Pali'oka'eo. So if you haven't been out for a while, go check that one out. It's definitely a workout, 2 miles of hills. As you folks probably know, we also have our rangers at the Moco Papapa Discovery Center in downtown Hilo, also a couple days, 5 days a week? 5 days a week, yes. So we're down there. I was there yesterday, and it was full. There was lots going on. We had our Ike Hana no Iao Hawaiian cultural program making hakule happening. Again, our HPPA partners really stepping up to the plate. Almost overnight, they made this amazing park store so people can still go and buy their educational and fun-like souvenirs through HPPA. And we have rangers at the Hilo airport to greet visitors when they're coming in at the arrivals area. You may have seen them down there. And also up here at the Volcano Art Center at the Neolani campus, our rangers are there as well. And before I hand the mic over, I wanted to also point out on the walls behind where the staff, underneath that clock there, we did bring in several large maps. I forgot to mention them earlier. There is an aerial map of the park closures and the road damage, that first one. It really shows, too, the difference of what the new maps will look like when we reopen, the difference in Halima'uma'u. To the right is the middle is the closure overview map, and then to the far right, we, a few weeks ago, with the help of Hawaii Department of Transportation, reestablished the evacuation route, had to remove lava, and so there is an evacuation route should Highway 130 be covered in lava out through the park. So those maps are there just for your information. The same set of maps is also posted on the way out. So I hope you take a peek at those. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rhonda Lowe. When she's not acting as a superintendent, she's our Chief of Natural Resources Management.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. I don't know.
The one on the right clicks forward.
All right, thanks. So as a natural resource manager, people always ask me, well, how are the birds and plants doing? Well, I think we don't know. We're not in there. That's my first response. But I think in general, you know, birds can generally relocate unless they're caught in a sudden event. But in general, they can relocate. And then, as you saw with the Kuaikea, the tropic bird, it's amazing. It's how it's adapted to its environment in that crater. The plants, maybe not so well. They can't really move out of the way out of the ash plume. But we're hoping once it's safe to do, we can monitor them. But we still have an active native plant recovery program. We did have to make some adjustments when the water line broke down to the nurseries. We had to actually relocate our plants in makeshift nurseries, thanks to the graciousness of some nice neighbors. Thank you. They allowed us to set up nurseries nearby, but in safer locations and with water. So we did that. And then some of the plants that were too big and they were getting ready to plant out, we were able to plant them out in Kahuku, where they were supposed to go. These are some rare ha-has, or lobeliads that were hiking out in Kahuku and planting. And then we were able to work with the incident command to do a special half day to do some planting to get some of these rare plants into the ground, since we didn't really want to move them out of the nursery. But there was no water, so we did get permission to get into Thurston for half a day. And that's actually not a photo. That's actually a photo of the Kahuku site. Sorry, I got that wrong. So we have been doing some planting in alternative work sites in Kahuku. We've also been working with our endangered species partners, the Hawksbill Turtle Program. So although we can't monitor the turtles in the park beaches, our program actually monitors and does recovery assistance for hawksbill turtles in and outside of the park. So we've just refocused more of our work out of the park and work with community volunteers. So here's at Awili, and we saw our first hawksbill tracks that were nesting, I think, this last weekend. We also have an air quality program. So many of you have checked the VOG dashboard and can see where we have 9 SO2 monitors in the highly visited areas of Kilauea Summit. So we're actually planning to establish a few more in Kahuku, and this is one of our employees setting up a monitoring at Kahuku. And we're also hoping to bring in particulate monitors too. So when eventually the park is able to open up, you'll also get both SO2 and particulate data. we've been able to do some invasive weed control in Ola'a. This is a picture in Ola'a. And we are doing fence repairs, and this is along the Kapapala boundary, because there's still natural resources out there that we need to work with. Some of our folks have also, when they aren't able to work in some of these areas, they're also doing some outreach. So this is John Fafford, our wildlife biologist at Kamehameha Schools, teaching students all about radio telemetry and how to track wildlife. And we have Kim Dillman. Normally she works in the park helping us with koki control. And because she can't work in the park right now, I think she's working 1 or 2 days in the evenings with the conquistadors over here. And so she's actually doing some monitoring and koki capturing around the Cooper Center area. And then this is David Benitez. Jessica mentioned the map where we recently have worked with Hawaii Department of Transportation to reopen the Chain of Craters Kalapana access route. So that's an evacuation route in case the Kalapana residents are unable to get out through 130. They'll be able to get through the park if in emergency. And what we've been doing is working with the agencies as they're doing construction to do sanitation inspections so that we don't inadvertently introduce whatnot, such as little fire ants or other pest species into the park unintentionally. So those are the kinds of activities in terms of natural resources we've been doing. And I think the next one is John Christensen, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Yeah, he'll talk about facilities.
Aloha ahi ahi kako. It's so great to see so many of you here in the audience, especially the friendly faces. Emphasis on friendly tonight. Thank you very much. I also am a resident of the Volcano Golf Course, and so I'm sure that you guys have all gotten to be experts at, and given even the seismologists a run for the money at being able to get with maybe 0.1 or 0.2 of the magnitude. Checking Quake Feed or the HVO website to find that out. So as was mentioned earlier, these earthquakes, they are more intense the closer that you get to them. The most of those have been centered within the park, and so our facilities are receiving a particularly heavy impact from that. And so I'm going to show you a few photos and talk to you a little bit about some of those impacts. Again, my name is John Christensen. I'm the Chief of Facilities Management, so I'm responsible for all of the human-built environment within Hawaii volcanoes, all the roads, buildings, utility systems, that sort of thing. So the facilities in the park really exist for two primary reasons. The first is to protect our cultural and natural resources. In many cases, and we'll see some pictures of the Jagger Museum and surrounding and HVO buildings later, in many cases the facilities are our cultural resources. And also to provide for safe visitor use to the park. So that's what I've dedicated my career to, is to maintaining these facilities to welcome visitors to the park. So it's especially difficult for me and for all of the park staff when we see our facilities being damaged and know that we can't safely welcome you to the park. That's like anathema to what we do. It's the opposite of what we all work for to do on a daily basis. So I just want to emphasize that from a facility standpoint, we just don't feel that it's safe for you guys to be in the park at this time. And I'll show you some pictures and talk a little bit more about why that is. You can see here just some examples of the damage to the road. Our water system is being damaged with each of these earthquake events. At this point, we've really stopped trying to fix them. We don't know where all the breaks are. We cannot provide for fire suppression. We can't provide for that safety for our buildings and for visitors because of that. What we've been told by the Department of Health is they really recommended that we not keep water in those lines because that tension from the water actually just makes it more likely it's going to break next time there's an earthquake. So we're really minimizing our facilities activities, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the park in a moment. As I mentioned, the earthquakes continue to degrade the water system. The photos become more dramatic as the weeks go by. Not only is the existing damage getting worse, this is near Kulana Okoiki campground on the Helena Poly Road. John Broward, our chief ranger, mentioned earlier, this is the entrance to Kilauea Overlook. This was Tuesday morning, that was fine. Midday Tuesday, crack in the road. Early afternoon, 1 hole. By the end of the day, 2 holes. And this is all that's keeping that 20-foot hole from being totally open. It's just a couple inches of asphalt. Okay? So you might say, oh, that's just right next to Halima'uma'u. Of course, that's where we expect the damage to be occurring. Just yesterday, the same thing happened right behind Kilauea Visitor Center. So this damage, as John was talking about, we're trying to, thankfully, because the park was closed, there was nobody on the wrong side of that, or worse, at that spot when that happened. Okay? The same sort of thing is happening in Overlook areas where visitors would be standing, not just where people would be driving. Cracks in the Jagger Museum are widening. A couple of weeks ago, that was a crack. 2 days ago, I could stick my hand into that crack where the column, the structural column on the corner of that building is separating away. And the cracks are occurring not only on the outside of the building, also on the inside here. This is right next to the doors that go, the double doors that go out onto the Jagger Overlook, where that side of the building is starting to slump away from the rest of the building. We'll see some more photos of the inside of the Jagger Museum. So we talked a little earlier, as John said, we know that we will be able to open the park someday. We feel that. So one of the things we like to do is, instead of just talking about why it's closed, but what are we going to need to do in order to be able to reopen the park? And so trying to think of that positive, okay, trying to get ahead of that. So right now, we don't know the extent of the damage to the park because first of all, we're not doing a damage assessment because, one, we know it's just going to get damaged further. So what's the point of spending the energy and effort to document something in detail that's just going to break worse probably tomorrow? The other more important reason is the safety of our staff. We just don't, it's not worth it to expose them to that risk, to those hazards of being in this area with this continued seismic activity in order to assess that damage. We know that it'll be there. We hope that we'll still be there when all of this is over to be able to go in and assess that. That's going to take some time for us just to document what damage occurred. Then we're going to need to prioritize that damage. We're going to need to make a plan for how we're going to repair it. That's going to include bringing in resources, staff, securing funding, contractors to be able to make those repairs. That's going to take some weeks. Now, some areas may be able to be open more readily and quickly, so we will open those areas as we can. But there are going to be some areas where it may be much more extensive period of time, where in the case of places like Halima'uma'u over parking lot will never reopen. It doesn't exist anymore. Okay? So really trying to focus on what are we going to do for the recovery, start having a plan for that. Okay? So talking about the Jagger Museum. So I'd just like to take a few moments to highlight some of the history of the structures there at Uwe Kahuna, the site of Jagger Museum and HVO. So starting with 1929, one of the things that's really interesting about this photo is that this is some of the wall that still remains there at the Jagger Overlook. So really talking about cultural resources where our facilities are actually part of the history of the park. Then this building was added circa 1930, and then you can see the grouping of those facilities, okay, as it evolves over time. So the geochemical building is on the left. That still remains. And this building, the lecture hall, is actually part of what's now Jagger Museum. So right here is where those double doors, the main doors, go in, and this is where the phone booth is, okay, and the water fountain. A reverse view, again, of those same buildings. And then in 1985, the newer building of HVO. So this is still that geochemical building, the lecture hall, the Jagger Museum behind the HVO observation tower. Again, that lecture hall portion of the building here. The restrooms that were added. There's significant cracks through the walls right here on that building right now. So last week, one of the great things about this national park is that we have such a rich history here, and a great history in which we share with our partners at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. And so we had some excellent museum collections that were within the Jagger Museum where people can come and learn about the history firsthand. They can see Jagger seismographs, they can see clothing that was worn by HVO geologists, volcanologists that were going in and actually collecting lava samples to help us better understand this volcano on which we all live. So here you can see some of the cracks, structural cracks, right through that extend through the building. The ash that's been deposited on the parking lot. Here's many of you have almost all of you probably have seen this collection of clothing, which has now been taken down and was carefully removed and being stored and curated by our museum staff off-site in order to protect it. And some of the other collection items that we've removed. And in case you missed it the first time, we're going to go through it again. Because there's a video. The guy who put this together really did a sloppy job. That was me. I don't know how that got in there twice. So this is a relocation. On June 19th, park staff removed artifacts and exhibit features from the Jagger Museum. Scores of earthquakes occur daily as the summit subsides and the crater grows in size. There you can see the cracks. This is carrying that clothing out that I mentioned earlier. It's Laura Schuster, our Chief of Culture Resources, removing some of the key facilities to prevent further damage. Although the building is damaged, the artifacts, now that they've been removed, are safe. So that's the Jagger Museum Overlook on April 22nd and on June 19th. And with that, I think we are ready to open it up to questions. I'll turn it back over to Jessica Farrakane, our Public Affairs Officer.
Okay, yes, as John says, we're ready for questions. I'm going to set a couple ground rules. So for everybody who has a question, please raise their hand. One question at a time, please. And we will do our best to get to everybody. So thank you. With that, Mr. Red.
Okay, of course, I live up here in Volcano, but I work in Pahoa. I drive through foggy air and a little bit of ash. I'd say only one day of serious ash. But we keep talking about, well, we're beyond the current data for this eruption. Seems to me we have a repository of data down in Pahoa called the Pahoa Ash Layer. And I've got actually multiple questions about the ash layer, and I hear nobody talking about it. I've heard essentially rumors that the ash layer runs from 5 feet to up to 30 feet deep. I don't know if that's correct. People have asked me, well, is that all from Kilauea? Is it from Mauna Loa? Is it from, Mauna Kea even? And as far as I know, none of this is out there in the public information. I'm just wondering if we can get the USGS to comment on that.
Tina, does somebody want to comment on the Pahoa Ash Layer?
The Pahoa Ash Layer is The Pahoa Ash Layer is a combination of several different deposits from different eruptions. Some probably from Mauna Loa. Perhaps some from Kilauea. There's some sketchy geochemical evidence that suggests that some came from Kilauea. The youngest dates on the Pahoa are about 15,000 years, I think, but different locations give older ages going back to 25 or 30,000 years. It's kind of a wastebasket now. We don't know much about it because it is so old, and that's why there's not too much in the literature about it. Probably none of the ash came from Mauna Kea. It's either Mauna Loa or Kilauea.
My question is probably everybody's question. I heard Don Swanson's put in a sentence, most certainly everything is going to be greater and more. Could you tell us more?
Well, the bottom line is that we don't know, and I think we've been talking about this in the staff a lot lately. We don't know how long this is going to last. I mean, we don't know if we're at the beginning, middle, or toward the end of it. But as every day goes by, more cracks are forming, and there's more subsidence taking place. So that was the reason behind my statement that we're going to have more. But we don't know how much more. And nor do we know if it's going to get more benign or more nasty. And Tina and Kyle can talk to that, and others here as well. So we're in a period of great uncertainty, but tomorrow we're expecting one of these events tonight. And so tomorrow there will be more down dropping, more cracks, and that I feel pretty comfortable saying. That's all I'm going to say now.
I don't know if this is for Mr. Broward or Mr. Christensen, but just hypothetically, I am not trying to pin you down. Can you imagine a scenario in which a small area of the park, like the Mauna Loa Strip Road to Bird Park, is opened sooner rather than later? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that, and specifically Mauna Loa Strip Road, because that's one area we've been talking about recently. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about using good data and good information from USGS. I talked to Tina earlier in the week, and we had another conversation today, and they feel that if there's any major event that could happen that would cut off Mauna Loa Strip Road for access, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence of the road itself going up to Kipukabulu and beyond. But the main critical part for us is the access. If it's on that fault line, if that were to get compromised, it'd be hard to access that road and get to people if something happened. But they feel there's some trigger points, as I mentioned before, where you start seeing those trigger points where they can say, hey, give us a call, and they say, hey, we're starting to see some problems. It looks like you guys need to close it back up again. So we started this discussion about 2 days ago about reopening that. There's a lot of things that we have to do before we get to that point. We can't just pull the cones out and say, come on in. There's biological surveys that need to be done, and just to make sure that the impact, once we open that, we expect hundreds, if not maybe thousands of people a day going up there. So we want to make sure that impact is not going to affect like the birds and other wildlife in there. And we also make sure we have staff to staff it. We have parking attendants to deal with parking issues. We have to make sure do all our scheduling in advance. So there's a lot of other T's we have to cross, like 5 or 6 things we got to do beforehand. So we just started that discussion probably yesterday, and so we're going to continue that discussion over the next couple of days and come to a decision point where we might actually open Mauna Loa Road. I can't say when, because there's a lot of things we have to do first. And luas being serviced and additional luas being put in. So there's a lot of things we have to do first. But then once we get all the pieces in place, then we can reopen the Mauna Loa Strip Road. Okay, no worries.
Tom?
Question. based on what you've been posting, it looks like Halemaumau has dropped down to the level of the water table of the perched aquifer. What are the implications of that?
Good question. We have learned something from this eruption, and that is that it takes longer than our previous thinking was telling us that for water to pour back into the conduit. We've had some theoretical models that have been run by hydrologists that suggest that it might take 2 months for groundwater to enter an empty conduit because of the heat. That's theoretical, but so the explosions that we anticipated happening because of the interaction of groundwater and hot rock haven't really taken place. The explosions that took place in late May, we think, were probably triggered not by steam from groundwater, but instead from gas that was coming off the magma. And we think that could be what happened in 1924 too, which if true would upset the apple cart, because 1924 has been considered to be a kind of classic example of a groundwater-driven explosion. One of the lines of evidence for this, I want to mention this because this is interesting. During this eruption and during the 1924 eruption, early on at least, you could see glow coming from the crater, and there were incandescent blocks that were ejected from the crater. That means that the temperature was something higher than about 600 degrees Celsius. And steam can't come anywhere close to getting that hot. Therefore, that is prima facie evidence that more than steam was being involved. Bottom line answer to your question is that the eruption has not proceeded the way that our dogma thought that it would. We've learned a lot from this process. It could be that as the eruption continues, this 2-month period that it takes groundwater to pour into the conduit may indeed do so, and we may start getting eruptions that are powered by steam from groundwater rather than magmatic gas. Does that answer your question?
It does, but the follow-up, which is maybe a physical preparation in the event that we may still be facing 1924 type ash and other explosive elements.
I think the implications are the same because, as I'm saying, I think that the 1924 explosions were created by the same processes that created the earlier ones here. So the hazards are not based on the model that we have for how the eruptions proceed. They're based on the deposits that we have been able to map from these explosions. Okay?
Just a quick question. Okay, with all the sides slumping in and coming down in the crater and going into the Iki, or Puka, yeah, Puka. I'm sorry. When it gets down there, does it turn into magma, or is it just going to plug up the hole and then explode?
So the slumping is occurring, we believe, as magma is evacuating the summit storage system to go down to the east drift zone. So what's happening, we believe, is that rock that's composing most of the caldera floor is breaking up, it's faulting, and it's slumping down to replace magma. So Yeah, so it doesn't become magma, it doesn't melt probably. We're just replacing magma storage with rock, so one becomes the other. So effectively, we're reducing the volume of magma that's stored in the summit as it's evacuated towards the rift zone. Does that answer your question? Right, so the question was when all those rocks pile up, or is that going to drive a larger explosion? Currently, there's no evidence that that's going to happen. We can't rule it out. The pressure, if you remember one of the plots I showed, it was that blue line that showed the downward trend. That's a proxy for the pressure in the reservoir. So overall, that's been on a downward trend. So we're not in a situation where the overall pressure on the reservoir is increasing and leading towards something larger. That's not to say that we can't have some explosive activity associated with this depressurizing system, but it's actually in contrast to what you normally think about at a volcano, where it pressurizes and then explodes.
Thanks. So I'm standing in line at Spectrum today, and I'm standing next to some guy that's pretty educated. And he says, well, I've heard that magma from Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea and possibly Hualalai are feeding into the magma at Halima'oma'o. Okay, that's just a rumor? Okay. But my question is, do we know for sure if the magma from Halima'oma'o feeds into Fissure 8? And then thirdly, what can make this all stop? Does it take a big earthquake?
I think that was 3 questions. So for the next question asker, please keep your questions to 1, but I'll go ahead and hand this over to Tina.
Okay, there were a few questions there. Let me see if I can answer them, and then Kyle and Don and Austin, Ingrid can rescue me, and Brian as well. So first of all, you all know that I think last week we downgraded the alert level for Mauna Loa from advisory to normal, and that's because we have been for many months now seeing that volcano be very quiet. So I just want to remind everybody of that, and we're still watching Mauna Loa even though our attention is all focused on Kilauea. The volcanoes are all separately fed in their upper plumbing system, so there is no magma mingling going on right now between the volcanoes. The question of whether Halima'oma'o Reservoir melt is now feeding Fissure 8 is still open to debate. We know we have flushed the system down there in the lower East Rift Zone of magma that had been sitting around for some time. We're seeing compositions come out of Fissure 8 that look a lot like what we were erupting at Pu'u'o. So for certain, we're seeing Middle East Rift kinds of compositions. Whether we're actually seeing Halima'oma'o melt, make it all the way down there, we really can't say with certainty. So that's the answer to the 2 questions. The third question was, what is it going to take to stop this? Good question. We're having lots of discussions about this, and I think what Kyle said is one of the things we can say with certainty is that as long as magma's leaving the reservoir and potentially going into the rift zone and potentially feeding the ongoing eruption in the lower East Rift Zone, things will continue largely as we're seeing them. The lower East Rift Zone eruption appears very steady. There's no sign that it's really slowing down. The gas emission values that were just taken yesterday were among the highest we've seen yet. So no sign that that's really slowing down. But we don't know absolutely for certain that there's an immediately open connection between the summit and the lower East Rift Zone either. So even if the lower Puna eruption were to stop tomorrow, we could still see deflation and exiting of magma from the summit reservoir system for some time. So it may not be an immediate response. A big earthquake, a big structural adjustment of the volcano, I suppose, could alter things enough that the system is so perturbed that deflation stops, but it's a little hard for me to envision how that might happen. We don't know how these things end. At some point, supply will resume to the summit area that exceeds the outflow, and at that time, deflation will stop and subsidence will stop. But exactly when that is, we really don't know. Kyle or Don, do you want to add anything to that? Okay.
Before I forget, I wanted to, for those of you with friends who couldn't make it tonight, remind you Big Island Video News is here, and David, thank you so much for coming out to do this for us free of charge. I think I didn't get a check yet or a bill in the mail, but if you want to, please bookmark Big Island Video News and make sure you watch this great recording tonight. Okay. Sir in the green hat, and then there was a blue shirt over here next. So, what's your question?
Well, my first question is actually a follow-up to the last one. It's like, you know, as concerned citizens, what can we do to stop this? No. Seriously, this is for our chief of facilities. We get, you know, rumors and a little bit of information here and there about what the damage is to the different facilities within the park. And I was just curious about the visitor center and about the KMC and, you know, our little post office, and if you had any information on what damage. Is the damage really widespread, or is it concentrated near Jagger? That was it.
Thanks for the question, Wolfman. So the short answer is we don't know. Because again, as I said, we're really not subjecting our staff to that risk to go in and do those assessments. There are certain key areas like HVO and the Jagger Museum where we see that activity, and so we, as part of our efforts to remove museum objects and those sort of things, we are observing those changes, but we have not gone in and systematically started to assess the damage, nor do we intend to in the foreseeable future. So anecdotally, I could just give you anecdotal of, you know, facilities here and there, but specifically no details.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I don't know if this is for Kyle or whoever. The Summit Reservoir is draining. Do we have a sense of how much is drained out? And that, I assume, is driving the subsidence and the seismic activity. And related to that, how much? Several weeks ago, I'd heard the summit elevation had dropped, give or take 3 feet. I assume it's dropped by more since.
So it's actually become a little more difficult to directly quantify how much material has left the Summit Reservoir, and that's because these slumping events are happening in a way that makes our simple deformation models a little bit more difficult to use. The best we can do right now is say that the volume of material that's subsiding down into the vent towards the reservoir is probably, to first order, very roughly, about the amount of material that's left. So as of June 21st, Halemaumau had increased in volume by about 300 million cubic meters. That's a rate of about, I think, 12 or 13 million cubic meters a day. That is probably a first order, again, just first order proxy for how much is going out towards the rift. It's a very high rate. I think it's 130 or 140 cubic meters a second. In terms of how much magma was stored up here before versus how much has left, again, it's a good question. We used to believe that the shallow Halemaumau Reservoir right there beneath the crater was probably on the order of 1, 2, 3 cubic kilometers, somewhere in that range. So by that metric, we've evacuated more than 300 million cubic meters. That's maybe 30% of that reservoir. Having said that, that's just the reservoir right in that area, and we have evidence based on the slumping throughout the caldera that we may be pulling magma from larger regions. So there's probably more magma storage involved in evacuating the summit than just that shallow Halemaumau Reservoir. Was there another part to your question? So it depends where you want to measure. Throughout the caldera, there's been tremendous subsidence. So some places more than 300 feet. The bottom of the crater, Halemaumau crater, is now a few hundred meters below where it was before. As you get further from the crater, those levels go down tens of feet maybe throughout the caldera, and then when you get out of the caldera, it's maybe a foot or two. So it's really localized, very strong subsidence right in the region of Halemaumau, considerable still throughout the caldera, and then much less outside of it.
Since you're here, is there any evidence that there might be a deeper aquifer below? I know drilling results around the island have found multiple layers of aquifers, and is there a chance that the magma column will interact with a lower aquifer?
So I guess I don't have a lot to add to what Don said in regards to the aquifer. I don't know of any evidence of another one. The best we can say about the water table in the region of the summit is from Keller Well, which is I think a couple of kilometers from the vent. In that well, the water table is about 600 meters above sea level. That is not right next to the reservoir or in the crater, so we don't really know how it varies spatially. And in terms of other aquifers, I really don't know, and I don't know that anyone would really.
Yes, I have a question for USGS. I follow the earthquakes here on the internet, and I've noticed that if there's a 3 or 3 point something or less, it gets posted almost immediately. But I noticed the last few times we had a 5.2s or 5.3s, it seems to take an hour or two to show up on the list. Do you know why that happens?
It's a good question. By the way, I'm Brian, by the way. Hi. So we added that to our frequently asked questions list. You can check it out on the website. It's been up since this morning. And the answer is the earthquakes less than about magnitude 4 are not giving us very many problems. We're able to post them just as we always have, automatically, very quickly. Our computer system is working very hard, as you might imagine, with all these earthquakes. When you get to the really large earthquakes, you're starting to see some mislocation. We don't want to alert people too much with a magnitude 4 point something earthquake in a place where it really isn't there. And so we want a person to look at that and verify it. And so if it's a normal fault-driven earthquake, that's a pretty quick process. But if it's one of these big collapse events that we were talking about today that happens at the summit, these are unusual beasts. They are due to this downdropping of material. They're due to gases getting compressed and expanded. They're due to basically a lot of processes happening all together. And it takes a human to look at that. And to accurately characterize the energy released by these, we really need to wait for the seismic waves to reach farther out stations than just the nearby ones. And so, in fact, we're waiting till it reaches all the way to California and Alaska. And so that takes on the order of half an hour. And again, the person has to look at it and work on it together. So we're coordinating with our partners at the National Earthquake Information Center in Golden, Colorado with this. Each time it happens, whatever time of day or night. And we try to do it in less than an hour. That's our goal. Does that answer? Okay.
Lady in pink back here.
Do you have an estimate of the elevation of the freshwater lens up at this altitude?
Freshwater lens. Okay.
The question was if we have an estimate of the elevation of the water table. Well, the water table is not perched. The Keller well penetrated the water table, and the rocks were saturated all the way down to sea level. So that's all that we have. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I keep overlooking. I think you're a park ranger and they're green and gray, so I was like, you don't get to ask questions. There you go.
Anyway, you know, all of us here, I guess, follow every minute of this thing. It's consumed our lives. So, but I'm really curious. At what point will they name Fissure 8? And just what's involved in this whole process? I know they have kapunas or kahunas. And of course, people up here with the history knowledge of you know, going back, you know, probably pre-civilization on this island chain. So,
thank you for that question. I was here as a young geologist in 1983 when this little fissure broke out on the letter O in the topographic map, and it became the O vent, and then it became Pu'o, and then it became Pu'o. So the USGS and HVO, we name things in the field for convenience, and we, as you know, we started numbering the fissures in the Lower East Rift Zone just so we could keep track of them. And as it turned out, it was fissure number 8 that became the locus of sustained effusion, and we're still calling it fissure 8. It's now grown into a substantial landform, and it's probably time for us to talk about naming that feature, but it's not our job. And frankly, I haven't had the mental space and emotional energy to think about that process, but we'll have to consult with the right folks in the region to do the proper thing. But I have no doubt it's a big conversation online. Okay. Well, I'm glad they're talking about that, I guess, and not Mauna Loa conspiracy theories or something. Yeah. So we are starting to talk about it, and we will confront that as soon as we feel ready. Okay.
Years ago, I was very shocked and impressed by that display you had up at the Jagger Overlook about what happened in 1400 when the crater collapsed, down 2,000 feet or something like that. And right now we're way beyond 1924, it seems. Are we headed in that direction? And if we are, I mean, I live in the golf course Pi'imana neighborhood too. Sometimes I wonder, is the road going to fall off? What are you thinking in terms of that issue? Are we headed towards something like that 1400 event?
I'm going to start, and then I'm going to start and then turn it over to the expert. So obviously that's a really important question that everyone here has thought about, including us. And I would just like to say that we're all living on the top of a volcano here, and we all live in earthquake country, and we should always be prepared for sudden events that can harm the infrastructure and harm our homes, and be ready to take care of ourselves. And as you saw in Lower Puna, be ready to move quickly if we have to, for any reason, hurricane, earthquake, tsunami, you name it. So that's one message. The second message is we have had a number of conversations with experts on the mainland, people who worked on Kilauea for a long time, experts looking at caldera collapses at volcanoes around the world, trying to extract as much insight from people in Japan and Iceland about this process. And at this point, our conclusion is that the likelihood of moving to something of that scale is very small. How small, I can't tell you. We're really not able at this point to put a probability number on it that we feel comfortable with, but I will say it is very small, and I would be comfortable saying it's highly unlikely. That doesn't mean it's impossible. But we're not seeing any sign of that right now. We're not seeing sign that that's imminent. We're not seeing sign that we're really progressing towards that, at least as best we can tell. But I wouldn't want to say it's completely off the table. And with that, Don Swanson has studied this process here at Kilauea, knows it better than anyone, and can probably give us the best context.
If I know it better than anyone else, that's an indication that we know very little about it. The collapse took place around 1500, not around 1400. But anyway, that's a detail. We don't know whether that collapse took place incrementally over a period of perhaps years to decades, and then culminated in some final collapse, which defines the outermost caldera. We don't know that. I have inferred from interpretation of Hawaiian chants that the last stage of the caldera downdropping was abrupt, because that's when Hi'iaka was digging to recover the body of Lohiau, and I would imagine that was recording a relatively rapid event, but we don't know what kind of events might have led up to that. Tina put it properly that we think with our current data that it is unlikely that we're going to have such widespread wholesale caldera collapse. But the important thing is that with the current data, that's what we think. As time goes on, I think Tina would agree that we may acquire more data that would give us perhaps more reason to think that there could be a larger scale collapse. Where we stand now, we think it's unlikely. Where we might stand in a couple of months, depending upon how things progress, might be somewhat different. I do want to point out, though, that the formation of a larger caldera than the depression that we have out here now isn't necessarily immediately going to be a bad thing. As best I can piece together, after the caldera collapsed in around 1500, there was a very large eruption of reticulite, and those of you who live in Volcano and here know that when you're digging in your yard, you're coming upon this reticulite. That was from very high fountains that if they formed today would burn forest and buildings in the volcano area if it were dry. But then after that, there wasn't a whole lot happening on a large scale for another 100 years or so. A lot of smaller eruptions, but confined mainly to the area around where Halemaumau is today. So, long addition to what Tina had to say, we think it's unlikely now that we're going to have a big one. Ask me in a month or two, and I might have a different answer. And even if we do have a big one, it isn't necessarily going to be terrible.
Thank you. This is an earthquake question. It seems in the last week or two, are the earthquakes that precede the 5.3 magnitude pressure wave, or 5.3 magnitude equivalent pressure wave, are getting bigger. We're seeing 3.8, 3.9s, no 4.0s that I've seen. And it seems that they're getting deeper, 0.7, 0.8 miles instead of 0.1 mile below the surface, and sometimes 0. So I'm wondering, what does that mean? Is the caldera breaking apart ever deeper and deeper and deeper as time goes on?
That's a good question. You're asking about these earthquake swarms that are occurring over a period of many hours leading up to these large collapse explosion events. And we know you're feeling them very strongly when you're up here. Every time I'm up here, I feel it too. We've seen basically a marching of the earthquakes in a certain degree outward from Halemaumau. So as the area of deformation has expanded, the area of earthquakes has expanded too. And so we think that the faults which are driving those somewhat smaller earthquakes in the magnitude 3 range up to about magnitude 4, that those faults are, which go around the circumference of the crater, are getting longer and perhaps a little larger, and that's maybe why the magnitudes are getting bigger too. So larger areas are slipping for those. Does that answer the question?
We seem to have a magic line that includes the perimeter of the park, that it doesn't seem to go beyond that line. But now that you said very lightly that we had some holes by the visitor center, and of course we have the cracks in the road, is it going to move farther out from the magic line of the perimeter of the park?
USGS?
I'll start, and then Ingrid or Asta, maybe you want to come up and speak a little bit about the deformation field. So some of the cracks that you're referring to in the road that happened during the bigger events kind of early in the sequence are just due to the ground shaking. Ground shaking so hard that the road fill moved and cracked the asphalt. They're not due to faulting related to the subsidence that we're talking about. That also may be true for some of the other road cracks further on towards the golf course as well. So right now we're not seeing anything outside. When you say the magic boundary of the park, I think do you mean the big caldera walls, the steep caldera walls? We're not seeing a lot of motion outside that boundary. Asta or Ingrid, do you want to come speak about that a little bit more? Sort of the limits of deformation that we're really seeing. So this is Ingrid Johansson, another research geophysicist.
So I might actually defer to Don at some point, because Don has made a survey of a lot of the cracks around Halemaumau. But I will say that there are a couple different processes that have produced cracks. Close to Halemaumau, it's mainly been these large slump blocks falling down into the crater. Up along the crater rim, the cracks there are more likely due to the repeated rock falls that are happening with each of these type A's, just eroding support from that cliff edge. I think it's unlikely that the crack behind the visitor center is due to a down dropping. Of course, I haven't looked at it, so I shouldn't say for sure that it's not. Likewise, as Tina said, these cracks on the road weren't associated with fault motion, the type of motion that we would expect to see from a piece of that moving down into the caldera. Don, is there anything else you want to say about the cracks back there? Okay.
As Ingrid indicated here, you have to actually look at the cracks in context to understand the mechanism that formed them. So that is one thing we're hoping to do more of in the coming weeks. Spend more time in the field, on the roads, on the safe trails to really look at some of these cracks, to look for evidence that it may be marching further outward.
Okay, we're down to our last 5 minutes, folks. So anybody who hasn't asked a question before I start hitting the repeaters? Okay, sir in the green shirt.
Okay, this is not a geophysical question. This is a question for Rhonda. I used to be the staff biologist at Maunalani Resort. Was just recently out there. Right next to Maunalani Bay Hotel, there's now, I counted the one day, 19 nene. Never saw nene in the 15 years I worked at Maunalani. And so of those 19, half had no bands, but half did. And of the ones with bands, 6, I noticed the bands resembled the bands of the nene up at golf course. And so I was just curious if you'd heard about anything of golf course nene migrating after all of this.
I was at Maunalani myself this past weekend. It is not a bad place to be.
We'd actually love to get your band numbers, and if you can send them to me, that would be great. So if the next time you go down there, or if you see nene with those bands, shoot a photograph and send it over to me, because we really, right now we're not in breeding season, so birds can move around. We know that what we call Hawaii volcano birds, the ones that tend to breed in the park, during the non-breeding season, they can move around in the island. We haven't heard of them going to Maunalani, and so we'd be really interested. And yeah, resort birds. Yeah, so that's actually very interesting for us because we're not really knowing how they're responding because we're not able to work in the Kilauea area of the park right now. We're not really knowing how these birds are responding. So that's actually very interesting data for us. Thanks.
Question for the geologist. Is there any significant subsidence outside of the caldera circumferential faults?
Ingrid.
So at this time, the really so at the moment, the really rapid deformation is confined to within the caldera. So on the southern boundary by that caldera fault that was visible in Don's photograph, there's actually a small sliver of the caldera floor on the sort of northeast side that has been relatively stable. So it's been showing relatively less motion. So the rapidly deforming area has in fact only been sort of a portion of the caldera floor. So I guess the short answer to the question was no, we're not seeing significant subsidence outside the caldera bounding faults.
It's 8 o'clock. We'll take one last question. I think the lady over here, no, she left. Okay, oh, take you. You haven't asked a question yet, so pass this back.
Yeah, this is a chicken and egg question. I've heard both ways. The earthquake comes first, or do the landslides come first?
We've had a contest at HVO, who can draw the best cartoon about what's going on. I think Brian's winning.
It is. So what comes first, a landslide or an earthquake? Well, at least with these big collapse events that we've been seeing, it's the down dropping that happens. It happens underground, under the caldera. Essentially the piece of the floor underground that moves as a result of the magma being withdrawn. But as a result, there are numerous rock falls that occur at that instant all around the edges of the caldera. And they make a loud sound as well, and they kick up a lot of dust, as Don mentioned too. So the event itself, the seismic event, is first. The rock falls come shortly after. It's all recorded by the instruments, and we try to sort it out. Does that make sense?
Right, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight and give a quick plug. We have a Kahuku Coffee Talk happening tomorrow with the Hawaii Wildlife Fund talking about their efforts to remove marine debris off the beaches on Hawaii Island. So come out, 9:30, it's free. And please be careful as you leave tonight. And thank you so much to USGS, to my team at Hawaii Volcanoes, and to Cooper Center, and to HPD for helping us out this evening. Mahalo.